The big recession debate. 2 quarters of consecutive negative GDP growth is one common way to define a recession. That's what happened in Q1 and Q2 of this year. But only one group in the United States officially declares a recession, and that is the National Bureau of Economic Research, the NBER. Joining us now is the president and CEO of the NBER, Jim Poterba. Jim, under the radar NBER, did you ever think there'd be so many articles and so much demand for what you have to say?
I will confess, Sarah, that I've been surprised by all the attention in the last couple of weeks. Absolutely.
So tell us, how do you define a recession?
So the NBER has a tradition of defining recessions, peaks in economic activity, and the beginning of recessions, which goes back nearly 100 years to the work of Leslie Claire Mitchell and Arthur Burns. Mitchell was the first director of research at the NBER in 1920. And it focuses on finding periods of time when a decline in economic activity is broadly dispersed across the economy and lasts for a period of at least several months. So its depth, duration, and diffusion are the 3 features of a downturn that the NBER would typically look at in trying to identify periods that would be categorized as recessions.
So is that what we're looking at right now?
That's the way the committee, the Business Cycle Dating Committee, will try to assess data as it emerges is for those attributes. The committee doesn't rely on the 2 quarters of declining GDP definition for a number of reasons. I mean, first, it looks more broadly at measures of economic activity than just GDP. Second, it is focused on a monthly chronology for peaks and troughs in economic activity. And if you're looking for monthly, GDP is reported at a quarterly level, so other indicators will tend to be important. And the third is, in some sense, that something as mechanical as 2 quarters of negative GDP admits the possibility that if you had 2 quarters when there were very slight declines in GDP, minus 0.1%, minus 0.1% again, that might not add up to a deep decline in economic activity. Think about something, a weather-related disruption in economic activity, say, or some geopolitical shock which occurs in the second half of a quarter. It reduces economic activity by just a bit during that quarter. It bleeds over into the next quarter. It again leads to lower economic activity then, but it resolves, and it is relatively narrow in terms of its impact within the economy. One could imagine a situation in which that generates 2 quarters of negative GDP, but it might not actually fit the rubric of depth, diffusion, and duration that would ordinarily be associated with a recession.
Got it. Not that we're facing anything like that necessarily right now, just that's why you wouldn't look at only 2 quarters of negative GDP. So Jim,
this is to conceptually explain, in some sense, why something as arbitrary as the 2 quarters might not be helpful.
What about jobs? How much does that factor into the picture? Some are wondering, how can we be in a recession when we're creating 300,000 to 400,000 jobs per month and have a 3.6% unemployment rate? How much does that factor in?
Employment is certainly an indicator of economic activity. It's certainly one of the many measures that would need to be considered in thinking about whether the economy is expanding or contracting. I do think that it's important to know that historically, low unemployment does not by itself rule out the beginning of a downturn, because the recession, the downturn, is about the change in activity. It's not about the level. So if you go back and look in the history of some of these things, in July of 1953, the NBER dates a peak in activity, the beginning of a downturn following that. Unemployment was 2.6%. In July of 1953. It began to increase in August. By October, it was up to 3.1%. So that's an example of where, despite the fact that the labor market was clearly tight at that point, when the turning point arrives, right, it's that you're seeing a decline a rise in the unemployment rate, a decline in the job market at that point.
So Jim, when do you expect to make this call about whether we're in a recession?
Well, the term data-driven is, I fear, a little overworn at this point. But the work of this committee is very much driven by the nature of the data and the degree to which different measures of economic activity line up and speak with one voice. If you look back over the period since the formal creation of the Business Cycle Dating Committee in the late 1970s, on average, it's been about 7 months between the peak of economic activity and the month when the committee made an announcement or determination. For troughs, it's actually been even longer, closer to 15 months. And in fact, the committee announced in July of 2021 that the trough in economic activity in the most recent downturn had been reached in April of 2020. And I think a lot of people were scratching their heads and saying, what's here? It's important to know that, in trying to figure out these peaks and troughs, it can often be easier to tell that things are declining or rising than to be able to assign a particular turning point. And the committee's task is typically to get the precision of it's this month. And that can lead the committee to wait somewhat longer to be able to get more clarity from the data that emerges.
So, I mean, we're in a midterm election year. No pressure to determine it before that. I know you're nonpartisan, clearly. So whether we're in a recession or not, is there any way to avoid potentially going into one, even if we're not in one right now, with the Federal Reserve hiking so much, with inflation so high? It's just not what we have been accustomed to in the last few years.
Yeah, no, I'll say two things. I mean, first, on the point about, we are in an election year, the NBER has never taken political considerations into account in making these kinds of determinations. It's a very non-political process. So I think that's very important to underscore. The other thing, though, to mention is, there's no secret data that the committee is looking at. These are all publicly available, and all of the information on the state of the economy, in some sense, is available to everybody who is looking. And really, the committee, in some sense, is not trying to do the same thing that many business economists and many of your viewers are trying to do, which is to make a real-time call on what's happening right at the moment. The committee is really more motivated by creating a chronology which, viewed retrospectively, as we try to have a conversation about what happens during expansions, what happens during recessions, which gets that chronology consistent across circumstances in very different places in different times. So part of the judgment that comes into this activity is trying to align the very different circumstances that could be facing an economy in April or May of 2020 with the circumstances in the first half of 2000 when we were coming off the bursting of the tech bubble, and trying to figure out how do you put the dating together in what are obviously very different circumstances.
Right. Well, Jim, we'll stay tuned. We're all ears. Thank you for joining us to demystify the whole process and how it works. We appreciate it.
Great to see you, Sarah. Take care.
You too. Jim Poterba, the NBER CEO.